Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today to hear what we at IDC have to say about the future of education. In fact, through this presentation, I am quite excited to discuss IDC's hybrid first framework for education put together by some of my very talented colleagues. But before we dive into it, I wanted to take a moment to run over the agenda for this presentation first. We'll start with acknowledging what our education systems have gone through and accomplished over the last 2 years and touch on where things are today. I'll briefly introduce the definition of hybrid first that my colleagues here at IDC have come up with. Based on that definition, we'll talk about why we believe that the future of education is hybrid first. We will then take a deeper look at the hybrid first framework and show an example of the framework in practice. And then we'll close the conversation with some guidance and recommendations for education institutions as they think about implementing this framework. As you see on the slide, we're fast approaching 2 years since we all first became familiar with the words coronavirus or COVID-19. And as we all remember, a few months later, the world abruptly shut down, not sparing schools across the globe. And within the first months of the shutdowns, 90% of the world's student population, which roughly equates to 1.3 billion students, were locked out of school, forced to isolate at home. While many schools across the world were able to move online in some capacity, there were still millions and millions of students unable to do so for a very long time, with drastic consequences for student outcomes in the long term. Initially believed to be just a short-term solution to control the spread of the virus, we are now well into the third consecutive academic year disrupted by the pandemic. And remote and hybrid learning are still ongoing, and there's still no clear end in sight. Today, the education landscape thankfully looks a lot different than it did 2 years ago. It's recovering from the damage done by the pandemic. This here on the slide is a screenshot of the COVID-19 Global Education Recovery Tracker, based on work done by Johns Hopkins University, the World Bank, and the UNICEF. It shows the predominant mode of learning at a country level and tracks these changes over time. This screenshot here is from the end of September, just a few weeks ago. As you can see, the dark blue is fully in person, and majority of Europe falls into that. Light blue here is hybrid, while green is remote, and orange is a mix of all those modes. You can see here that there are still school closures to this day, but only a small handful of places in the world are still stuck in the situation. Now, while the map is showing that the majority of institutions in the country are doing what they're doing, but when you zoom in, you realize that within the countries, the mode of learning can vary significantly at the local level. Moving on. So what did we learn from the last 2 years of COVID? First, and you're probably really tired of hearing this, but it has to be said, education as we know it has been forever changed. We're simply not going back to the way things were. But that's certainly not a bad thing. A fail fast, fail often approach, which whether it was forced or intentional, has led to some incredible innovations in education that will be well served to carry on into the future. Also, early challenges with online and hybrid learning have taught us some valuable lessons that will help to improve teaching and learning experiences in these domains. We also learned that our education systems enabled by technology can truly be adaptable, agile, creative, and resilient in the face of some of the most difficult challenges. And lastly, remote and hybrid learning is certainly not a one-size-fits-all, but we have been gifted with an opportunity to discover where it works and where it doesn't, and what tremendous benefits these modes of learning can bring to education institutions, as well as the students. Therefore, IDC believes that the future of education will be hybrid first. You're probably wondering now, what exactly is hybrid first? And for that, we have a definition here for you. Hybrid first is an institutional approach, which means it's run by at the institution level, it uses a hybrid experience infrastructure to enable service continuity, regardless of physical location, and to seamlessly shift between remote and in-person services. In the upcoming slides, I'll break down this definition for you a bit by bit. But before we do that, let's dive into why we believe the future of education is hybrid first. We have three broad drivers here beyond the pandemic. The first is that disruption is now the norm, it's not the exception. Before COVID-19, we had natural disruptions like severe weather events and environmental crises. We had man-made and technical disruptions, including traffic accidents, road repairs, network outages, and we have business economic disruptions like recessions that are all compounding pressures bearing down on education institutions, forcing them in many ways to continuously adapt and evolve. The second reason, and quite a significant one, is that students are now demanding high-quality digital learning experiences. Although they recognize and appreciate that there are flaws and challenges, they've also experienced other benefits of remote and hybrid learning. For example, the flexibility to be remote or in person based on their preferences is now a strong motivator for wanting remote or hybrid learning to continue. And lastly, synergy between education and work has been lost. And what I mean by that is that the needs of the workforce are constantly and rapidly changing. And education institutions have historically had a hard time keeping up with this change. As we shift towards lifelong learning, where people will find themselves needing and wanting to continuously upskill and reskill to remain competitive in the workforce. Education institutions from K-12 to all the way through higher education will need to be able to provide services to students at all of the different stages of their life and career. Hybrid access to education and learning here is an incredible tool to support learners of all ages. Now, our research here at IDC shows that education leaders are seeing the value in the shift towards hybrid and remote learning. In fact, in our US K-12 Teacher Technology Experiences survey conducted in February of this year, we asked educators to identify the top challenges spurred on by the pandemic and which of these challenges will last beyond the pandemic. You will see here that with the light blue bars on top, there are changes brought on by COVID, and the lower dark blue bars are changes that are going to last beyond COVID. Educators anticipate that online communication digital tools in the classroom, digital workflows, and online and hybrid learning are not going anywhere. While I appreciate the survey is from the US, this very much applies to European education institutions as well. So with that, let's return to our framework, the hybrid first framework. This diagram is meant to serve as a very simplified visual representation of the framework and how it works. The hybrid experience infrastructure, is a blue bar across the bottom, which represents the technological infrastructure that enables an institution to shift seamlessly between remote and in-person experiences. This applies not just to teaching and learning experiences, but also the back office administrative classroom or campus experiences as well. We can create this hybrid experience infrastructure by connecting these three core elements of the framework, which are people, process, and technology across the front and back-end user experiences. I will explain what I mean by this in the next slide. So here is a more detailed breakdown of the framework. And while the slide is a little busy, I will break it down for you. This framework is designed to be broadly applicable across any type of engagement or experience. So you can think of applying to an academic program, meeting with your guidance counselors, academic or career counselors, connecting with alumni, delivering course instructions, you name it, and the framework is built to enable you to create a hybrid first experience. It does so by enabling institutional leaders to outline the people, process, and technologies involved in a particular experience, to determine where there are operational or process bottlenecks and where there's a risk of drop off or lack of follow up or inefficient use of resources or disconnected systems or applications that hold back a seamless back and forth shift between remote and in person. Explained a bit further, the front end users here are the external stakeholders that are directly engaged with the institution. So you think of students, parents, partner organizations, vendors, and so on. And the back end users or your back office administrative or support staff or even faculty. You select any type of experience that you want and slide it into this flowchart here and work through the different stages of the experience. Each of these boxes are different engagements or touch points along the process of that experience. And inside the boxes, you outline the people and the technology involved at that stage. By doing this, you can identify opportunities to invest in the right digital infrastructure, which will help you align front and back-end user experiences in one seamless workflow with a focus on enabling in-person and remote capabilities for that experience. Now, to demonstrate how this works, I have outlined an example that was inspired by my own experience of my university, trying to find a time to meet with an academic advisor. Now, my academic advisor was fantastic, but very limited in her technological capabilities, as many students across the world are currently experiencing. So at first, I would email her with a list of times during the week that I could meet with her and send it off. The only way that I could do this communication is through email. Now, the advisor would hopefully see the email within that day. More often than not, it took her about 24 hours or so to respond to me. And she'd come back and say, this particular time works. Again, this communication was conducted via email. I show up to the meeting in person only because there's no virtual option. And I have to then check in with the office manager and let her know that I'm here for my appointment. The office manager would get up from her desk, walk over to my advisor and let her know that I've arrived. I would sit in the waiting room and wait for her to be ready. And then when she did, she'd come out and get me and we'd go and sit down. There's really no technology involved in the check-in process or the meeting process. Now that's extremely inefficient, isn't it? It took us a very long time to determine a time to meet, and there was no self-service option for me to be able to figure out what works for both of us. There's a risk of ineffective use of human resources. So I have wasted a lot of time, my advisors has wasted a lot of time, and the office manager's workflow has been disrupted. And then there is no alternative meeting option. I had to be in person, and so did my advisor. So this is taking the hybrid first framework and implementing it in practice. As you can see, there's already one step of the process that's dropped off. Now, let's just say my school has adopted an application that I could download on my phone that allows me to access meeting scheduling for any of the services I might need at the institution. I pick my academic advisor and try to find a time that works for both of us. I go right into our calendar, select an open window of time, and submit. It sends us both the calendar invite with an automatic link to sign in through a virtual option if it's necessary. And we get automated alerts to let us know that we both need to be there. So there's no risk of drop off or lack of follow up. Now, let's just say I want to go in person. I can check in through my mobile app, or there could be a virtual check in desk when I get there. So I don't have to disrupt the office manager in whatever is that they're doing. And then I sit and wait. And let's say I'm virtual. I could check in on the online video conferencing platform and sit in a virtual waiting room. Now, if I'm in person, the advisor comes up and gets me. We sit down and have a meeting. But let's just say something came up and I can't be there in person. We can both sign into a virtual conferencing platform and meet. And now we have eliminated the inefficiency of appointment scheduling. We have provided me with a self-service option to make that more efficient and streamlined. We have eliminated the risk of drop-off. We freed up the advisor and the office manager to focus on other high-value tasks. And it provides alternative meeting options if something comes up. This is, of course, a very simplified but true example of what hybrid first looks like in practice. Now, in this year's IDC's Education Futurescape document, you'll find a prediction about hybrid first. And with that, IDC believes that by 2024, 40% of education institutions across the globe will adopt a hybrid first approach to operations and service delivery, driven primarily by high demand for flexible learning options from students and lifelong learners. So with that, what should education institutions interested in implementing this framework do today? In anticipation of this question, we developed a detailed checklist for institutions to follow. The checklist is available on IDC's website. But in the interest of time, I won't go into detail about each and every one of these bullets. But to quickly summarize, there are two big things education institutions need to do. First, build a strong hybrid first foundation. Now, this is about setting up the institution to be able to be hybrid first and all things by setting up strong digital foundations, process foundations, and ensuring that there is buy-in from across the institution. So you make sure that you have procured the core technologies that are necessary for the framework. Think high-speed broadband and connectivity, video conferencing platforms, cloud platforms, which are absolutely necessary at the core of the hybrid. Now, a lot of institutions have made strong investments in technology during the pandemic to be able to be remote or hybrid for the first 2 years. And so many institutions might already have the capabilities to really set themselves to be hybrid first. But it's important to evaluate where you are today and conduct a gap analysis to determine where investments still need to be made and where changes need to be made. It's important to gain buy-in across the institution. Make sure that everybody is on board with change after so much change has occurred over the last few years. And then lastly, it does not matter if you have the best technology in place or you have buy-in if you don't change the very processes involved in the workflows of your front and back end users. So you make sure that you have identified which processes need to change to be able to be remote or digital or in person at any stage or any experience that you try to change. The second big thing is outline and execute a hybrid first strategy. So this is identifying quick win opportunities for implementation. This is focusing on high value engagements that improve front end experience. So going back to the example that I used earlier, if one of the big reasons why a lot of students at your institution are struggling to get through their academic program is because they are unable to meet with their academic or career advisors, then that's a high value engagement that you want to be able to shift to hybrid first. It's also important to co-design your hybrid first experiences with front end and back end users. This can help you determine where the highest value can be met, also where it doesn't make sense to implement this, or maybe not the right way. It's really, really important to involve both the front end and back end users in this process. Finally, it's also important to empower front-end users to self-select the designed experience. It's really hard for all of us to predict which students might be really successful in a hybrid remote setting versus those who won't be. But if you set up the infrastructure so that any student can choose an in-person experience, if that's what they want, or remote experience for that matter, you will have the best possible outcomes for this. So, to the best of your ability, it's important to empower front end users as much as possible. And lastly, continuously evaluate your hybrid first processes and iterate. You don't have to have the most perfect process or workflows in place right away. There will always be new challenges and things you didn't anticipate. So it's important to constantly evaluate whether or not your hybrid first transformations have actually achieved the desired goals and iterate not if they have not made the changes and improvements as you go. Now, you may ask why it is important for education institutions to be distinctly hybrid first. We thought about it, and it's simply because many institutions across the world have had really big challenges over the last 2 years shifting to remote or hybrid, particularly early in the pandemic. Because really, the only ability they had at the time was to put a clamp, put a video camera in the back of the lecture hall, and have the teacher teach the students who, as you know, were in the Zoom or other classroom. It looked exactly like the online experience, but shifted virtual. And we all know that does not work very well. But if you intentionally design all of these processes to be intentionally hybrid, then this can be a lot more successful. So that's why we wanted to make sure that we call this hybrid first and not just provide some sort of hybrid framework, because that will not foster the right mindset among institution leaders to determine how exactly they accomplish this. And what's really interesting and cool about this framework is that it really is designed to be applicable to almost any experience. It might not be applicable to every possible experience, but to almost any experience. And that's really designed to be able to impact the end user experience. It's not about how you deliver course instruction to a student who is in elementary school versus how you deliver to a student that's in higher education. It's about the infrastructure that's in place to enable that. And with that, I would like to end this presentation. Hopefully, you gained some sort of insights from that brief presentation. We have related content on our website if you're interested to explore a bit further about the framework and also the predictions that we have put together for education for the year 2024. Thank you for your time.